There is a quiet war happening inside the British royal family right now. And this one is not playing out on balconies or in front of cameras. It is happening in private rooms, through signed papers, through lawyers walking through doors that most people never even knew existed. At the very center of this storm stand two people who spent decades staying out of trouble, staying loyal, and staying silent. Prince Edward and his wife Sophie. And they have finally had enough. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a woman who knew exactly what she was doing in the final years of her life. Queen Elizabeth II was not someone who made careless decisions. By the time she reached her 90s, she had spent more than 70 years watching her family from the inside. She had seen the arguments. She had seen the heartbreak. She had seen what happened when people were not properly protected. So before she left this world, she made sure the people she loved most were taken care of. One of those people was her youngest son, Edward. Elizabeth had watched him carefully for decades. He never chased headlines. He never caused a scandal that embarrassed the family. He stayed close to his mother, supported her work, and kept his head down while the rest of the family made news for all the wrong reasons. In her eyes, that quiet loyalty deserved something real in return. The thing she had in mind was the Duke of Edinburgh title. This was no ordinary honor. It had belonged to Prince Philip for more than 70 years. It was the name the world knew him by. It was the role that defined his entire life beside the Queen. And Elizabeth had already made her decision long before Philip passed away. That title was going to Edward. She was clear about it. She had made it known. And when King Charles III officially gave Edward that title in April of 2023, it was simply the fulfillment of his mother's final wish. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because the title was only one part of what Elizabeth left behind for her son. The other part was a place called Bagshot Park. Now, if you have never heard of Bagshot Park, let me paint the picture for you. This is a grand old mansion, 120 rooms inside a Tudor-style building, sitting on 51 acres of beautiful land within Windsor Great Park. It is the kind of home that carries history in every wall. And Elizabeth had specifically tied this property to the Duke of Edinburgh title in her final written instructions. She signed a letter of intent stating that Bagshot Park and the Edinburgh title were meant to stay together. And Philip himself, even as he was dying, witnessed that letter. He put his name on it because he understood exactly why it mattered. Without it, Edward could one day find himself holding a grand title with absolutely nothing beneath it. That was the protection Elizabeth and Philip built for their son. But once Elizabeth was gone, a different kind of thinking took over inside the palace. King Charles had always believed, in a very quiet and very firm way, that he had the final say over royal property and everything connected to it. He believed that modernizing the monarchy meant reviewing old agreements, tightening things up, cutting costs where possible, and if necessary, taking things back. He saw himself not just as king, but as the manager of the entire royal enterprise. And somewhere along the way, Bagshot Park ended up on his list of things to review. That decision set in motion a fight that nobody saw coming. Edward had not simply been handed Bagshot Park as a gift. The truth is much more interesting than that. When the property was offered to him back in 1996, nobody really wanted it. The army chaplain who had been using it had moved on, and the building was in rough shape. Outdated, worn down, and ignored for years. The Crown Estate had actually considered turning it into a hotel or a conference center. That is how little value it held at the time. Instead, Edward took it on under a lease signed in March of 1998. His rent was set at £5,000 a year for 50 years. That low rent came with a very serious responsibility. He had to fix the place himself. And he did. Edward put in over £1,300,000 of his own private money. Money he had earned himself before he ever became a full-time working royal. The total cost of the repairs came close to £3 million. Once the work was finished and the estate was restored to something truly magnificent, his rent was raised to £90,000 a year, which was confirmed as fair market value by the National Audit Office. He paid it without complaint. He followed the rules. He did everything the right way. Then, in 2007, he went even further. He paid £5 million through his own company to extend the lease to 150 years. He was building a real home for his family. He was building security. He was building something that would last. Now fast forward to 2026. That same property is worth approximately £30 million. When pressure started coming from inside the palace for Edward to give it up or renegotiate its future, it was very easy to see what was really going on. A £30 million asset sitting in Edward's hands was too tempting for the Crown estate to ignore forever. Philip had seen this coming. That is exactly why he witnessed that letter before he died. He had spent over 70 years watching how the institution worked behind closed doors. He knew how quietly and efficiently the palace could move against people it no longer found useful. He was not going to let that happen to his youngest son. So he made sure Edward had something in writing that could not easily be undone. On the 25th of March in 2026, Edward made his move. A team of senior property lawyers walked into the Crown Estate offices carrying a legal file that had been built carefully over many years. Inside that file was everything. The original lease showing every penny Edward had invested. The letter signed by Elizabeth and witnessed by Philip, tying the estate to the Edinburgh title. And 20 years of records proving that Edward had maintained the property at a standard that actually saved the institution money. 3 layers of protection all pointing in the same direction. This was his home. It was given to him with the full authority of the late Queen. And it was not going anywhere. But the legal battle over the house was only half the story. Because around the same time, something else happened that crossed a very personal line. Earlier in 2026, a palace official arrived at Sophie's door with a clipboard and a quiet instruction. The visit was framed as a routine jewelry review, a national heritage check. That was the official description. What it actually meant was this. Someone had come to question ownership of a tiara that Sophie had worn as her own for 25 years. That tiara was called the Anthem Tiara. It was not pulled from some general collection. It was made specifically for Sophie's wedding in June of 1999. Queen Elizabeth II had commissioned it herself, using antique pieces from the private collection of Queen Victoria, shaped into a beautiful honeysuckle design. For nearly 2 decades, it was the only tiara Sophie ever wore at royal events. That detail tells you everything. Sophie was never given the kind of open access to grand state jewels that some other senior royals enjoyed. She was kept at a certain distance from the inner circle. The Anthem tiara was her one piece, the crown that was made just for her. The argument coming through official channels was built on legal language, but the message was sharp and clear. Because the tiara had been made using gold and stones from Queen Victoria's time, it could technically be classified as crown property. That meant it should be held in the central royal vault and only brought out for official occasions. Sophie would no longer own what she wore on her wedding day. She would have to ask permission every time she wanted to wear it. That crossed a line that Edward could not let stand. His legal team responded immediately with a document that shut the argument down at its very foundation. It was a deed of gift, signed by Elizabeth back in 1999. It stated in plain language that the Anthem tiara was a private wedding present, not a state loan, not a shared asset, not something held in trust. It belonged to Sophie. Elizabeth had also honored Sophie with the Royal Victorian Order, a personal honor given directly by the monarch for service and loyalty. Put it all together and you have a very clear picture. Elizabeth gave Sophie that honor. She gave her a tiara for her wedding. And then she signed a legal document making absolutely certain it was hers forever. That is a queen making a direct and permanent statement about a woman she trusted completely. Edward had gone even further than that. Back in 1999, he had worked with royal jewelers to create a matching set of black and white pearl jewelry for Sophie, a necklace and earrings designed to sit perfectly alongside the Anthem tiara. The materials came through the crown, but Edward held the design rights. His lawyers argued that the tiara and the pearl set formed a single artistic unit connected to Edward's own creative work. You cannot take one without breaking the other. That added yet another layer of legal protection around something that should never have been questioned in the first place. And behind all of this legal language sat something deeply human. Sophie had lost her own mother when she was still quite young. Over the years, Queen Elizabeth II became the closest thing she had to a mother figure. That bond was real, and it was known inside the family. At a reception in Buckingham Palace in October of 2019, Sophie was giving a speech in front of senior royals and guests. In the middle of that speech, she turned toward the Queen and said the word that surprised everyone in the room. Mama. It slipped out naturally, without planning, in a place where every word is usually carefully chosen. That one moment told the whole story. The woman who signed that deed of gift was the woman Sophie called her mother. And now another woman was trying to take away what that mother had given her. By the afternoon of the 25th of March, Edward's legal team delivered a warning that nobody in the palace could ignore. If the claim on the tiara was not dropped by the end of the day, they would release private letters written by Elizabeth herself. Letters that clearly stated her wish for Sophie to keep full ownership of all her personal jewelry. And according to people close to the situation, those letters contained words about Camilla as well. That threat shook the palace to its foundations. Because releasing those letters would not just defend Sophie. It would drag years of buried history back into the open. The long and difficult road it had taken before Elizabeth ever truly accepted Camilla. The cold distance that never fully disappeared. King Charles had spent years carefully rebuilding Camilla's public image, turning her step by step from one of the most unpopular figures in Britain into a queen consort. Those letters could undo all of that work in a single afternoon. Into this atmosphere walked Princess Anne. She stepped into a private meeting with King Charles, and she did not soften a single word. She had watched how things were developing. She had reviewed the Bagshot Park documents herself. She understood every detail of what Edward had paid and what he had signed. And she came with one message. These things were given by their mother. They were backed by signed documents. And they would stand. And made a statement in that room that stopped everything. She told Charles directly that if their mother's signature on a lease or a deed of gift meant nothing today, then his own signature would be worth even less tomorrow. She was not just defending Edward. She was defending the entire foundation of royal authority. A king's word only carries weight because of all the monarchs who came before him. Tear that apart and the whole structure weakens. She also brought up Edward's children, James and Louise. There had been quiet pressure building to push them out of their protected positions earlier than their parents had planned. And ended that conversation immediately. She made clear that this decision belonged to the children and their parents, not to anyone else. By evening on that same day, two things happened. The palace sent a formal note confirming that the anthem tiara would remain under Sophie's exclusive private control forever. And the review of Bagshot Park was quietly shut down. The official wording described it as recognition of the Edinburgh household's contribution to maintaining the estate. But inside the palace, nobody misunderstood what had just happened. The crown had been forced to step back. Everything Queen Elizabeth II had given to Edward and Sophie was confirmed, in writing, exactly as she had intended. That note will sit in the royal archives long after everyone involved has passed on. And when it is read by future generations, the meaning will be plain. A claim was made, failed, and the institution had to say so in writing. But the victory came with a cost that cannot be undone. The relationship between Charles and Edward has been permanently changed. What the public will see going forward is duty. Two brothers standing side by side at ceremonies. Polished appearances. The kind of unity that the royal family has always put on for the cameras. But behind that image, everyone who knows what happened will understand the truth. One of them had to protect himself legally from the other. That does not fade. That does not disappear after a handshake. Inside the family, something has shifted that cannot be shifted back. And somewhere in the English countryside, inside a home that could not be legally taken from him, Prince Edward, the quiet son who paid his own way, followed every rule, and asked for nothing except to keep what his mother gave him, continues to live exactly where Queen Elizabeth II always intended him to be.